Great. We're going to get started because we only have an hour and we have a huge amount to get through. So welcome everybody to this lunchtime session. I hope you've all brought your sandwiches with you, and feel free to keep your cameras off so that you can enjoy your lunch in peace. We're going to be going through, we've got a few speakers this afternoon, and we're going to start off with our very own, Pasture for Life's very own Sarah Hall, who's going to give us a very brief overview of methane emissions and what is, why methane is important, which I'm sure many of you will already know, but it's good to kind of set the scene. We're then going to hear from Ed Towers, who is a dairy farmer. I will let him introduce himself in more detail when he speaks, who has been using a methane inhibitor supplement, and it'll be really good to hear from him. And then finally, we're going to hear from Professor John Newbold from SIUC, who has been working specifically on this area and is a dairy nutritionist. And again, John will be able to give more detail about his work when he introduces himself. What I do want to say at the start of this is that the reason that Pasture for Life decided it would be a good idea to put this webinar on was because there is so much debate and discussion about methane suppressants and various different approaches to reducing methane emissions at the point of emission from the animal. And that's something that I think is not necessarily the Pasture for Life view is probably not the same as others within the sector, within the maybe more intensified, particularly intensive dairy systems. But we do feel it's really important to have the conversation and to hear from people that are actually engaged in this, rather than deciding our own opinion or holding a view without having the debate and having the discussion. So this is very much about, let's hear more from people who are working on this area to inform ourselves and to help us to develop our own thinking around this, and particularly as we go forward, whether that's in relation to policy or whether it's in relation to farm practice. As I said, we've got a huge amount to get through this afternoon, so I'm going to hand straight over to Sarah, who's going to do a short presentation, and then we will move on to Ed, followed by John. So over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. I will say, actually, I think we thought we'd go John, then Ed, actually, because I think John's talk may then lead into Ed. Sorry, Ed, I'm going to bump you to the end there, but yeah, I think that was the order we finally agreed on. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody, Nikki, will you let me know if for any reason it doesn't come up?
Yeah, I will. We're not seeing anything just yet.
Okay. Oh, hang on a minute. Maybe I didn't press this properly.
Yep, got it. Just need to put it in presentation mode, and then you'll be good.
There we go.
Perfect.
Yeah, so thanks everybody. And as Nikki said, I'm just going to do a really brief rush through methane and methane suppressing supplements to sort of set the scene for John and Ed, who know far more about it, but I'll crack straight on. So absolutely everybody's aware about the importance and the impact of methane, and especially within the global agricultural picture, and it's very much putting the spotlight on farmers. Adding additives to the cow's diet is potentially, as Nikki said, currently a limitation for Pasture for Life certified farms without the feeding regime to mix additives too. However, absolutely critical that we understand the landscape around the conversation and potential plans. I think that's especially worth just pointing out that the Welsh and Scottish government are very much at a monitoring the market stage and looking at evidence coming through. England is a bit different, and I was quite interested that DEFRA actually, their last statement on it was that DEFRA considers that methane suppressing feed products are an essential tool to decarbonate the agricultural sector. We're committed to working with industry to stimulate the market, encourage uptake of these products, and our ambition remains to develop a mature market and mandate the use of safe and effective products in suitable cattle systems in England as soon as feasible, and at the very latest by 2030. So I think it's clear that the future of methane supplements and the implications for the animal, the regulatory requirements, how it's going to be funded, and its potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is definitely something we all need to understand. So, methane. 13% of UK greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the agricultural sector, and of that, 55% are caused by methane. It's pretty clear that methane is a significant greenhouse gas, and it's probably, a lot of you will know, it's around 25 to 28 times more potent, or has the 25 to 28 times more warming effect than carbon dioxide. So it's a quite potent gas. However, we also know it's got a shorter lifespan, and so it's out in the atmosphere for around 10 to 12 years. That's a little bit simplified, but essentially it's much, much shorter lifespan than something like carbon dioxide, which is going to sit in the atmosphere for centuries. So I know it's probably worth mentioning, and again, quite well known by a lot of the farming community, certainly, that there is the problem at the moment that the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, are currently using metrics that measure warming impact of emissions over 100 years, are called GWP 100. And it's very much clear now through work that was originally done by Miles Allen at Oxford University, that actually with the methane having a much smaller lifespan in the atmosphere, there is a better metric to put forward, which is GWP star. And so all figures that we're currently looking at around greenhouse gases together is working off this metric that considers them to be out in the atmosphere for the same length of time. However, I think there's some signs that that will get altered in the near future. But all that said, we've signed up to the Global Methane Pledge. That's to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So it's a low-hanging fruit. It's an easy win because of its lifespan. And so governments and global organisations have very much got their eyes on methane as they aim towards their net zero targets. This is just really quickly just to sort of put methane in the picture. You can see here we've got global on the left as a percentage and EU on the right. Essentially, probably the main thing to point out is, because this is percentages, we've obviously moved a lot of our energy, methane emissions from the energy industry have reduced because we've outsourced or reduced our own industrial production in the EU, and we don't have rice cultivation. But what that means is that the enteric methane, that's the methane coming from ruminants, is attributing for a much greater percentage of our methane burden. Really briefly, because I know that John will be covering this in much more detail than me, but essentially the rumen microbial community, this is the fermentation stomach for ruminants, provides a unique ability to convert human indigestible plant matter into high quality protein. So it's an absolutely fantastic thing that we all love. But there's one type of bacteria, and pronunciation here, methanogens, I think it can be pronounced a different way as well, constitutes about 1% of that rumen total microbiome. And it's found everywhere in the lining, floating within the rumen content. The name is hinting to the fact that these bacteria produce methane. That's a metabolic byproduct for them. They're utilizing hydrogen and carbon dioxide as substrate, and the methane is what the bacteria is then releasing as part of that process. It's fantastic in that it is actually reducing the ruminal hydrogen levels, which is providing favourable conditions for fermentation to continue. But it does actually take about 2 to 12% of the gross energy intake away from the cow. If we look at it a bit more, and I think it's really important to kind of consider enteric methane. Obviously, agriculture is an anthropogenic process created by humans, but actually methane released from cows is entirely natural, and it's part of what's known as the natural carbon cycle. So 0% methane in the atmosphere is an absolute disaster. We're definitely not aiming for no methane. Ideally, what we do want, though, is a balance between the land and the atmosphere, its natural sinks. And that's what we had for millennia, so that we don't suffer these detrimental global warmings through greenhouse gas such as methane. The diagram's basically showing that methane is produced by ruminants, it's released into the atmosphere. Water in the atmosphere reacts with UV light, and it produces some highly reactive molecules called hydroxy radicals. They degrade down the methane back into carbon dioxide and water, and that's why it has this shorter lifespan. And then the carbon dioxide is converted back into carbohydrates by the plants with the photosynthesis, and then the plants are eaten by the ruminant and it travels around again. So obviously, if it was in perfect balance, this would just go round and round without any net increase. So that sort of leads on to the fact that we're not in perfect balance. We do have greenhouse gases, going out into the atmosphere that are causing us problems. Methane is definitely one of them. And so what's the toolbox that we can use within agriculture to actually manage it? And there are a lot of tools that we can use. The most commonly used, and we're all familiar with, is offsetting. So we've got the consideration of all those greenhouse gases together. And then you can look at other places that methane may be coming from, like the manure management. You can consider renewable energy on farms, minimizing your inputs and efficient nutrient cycling, and of course, maximizing carbon sequestration. We also have, and it's very commonly discussed, is lifetime efficiency. So of course, as a mathematical calculation, the more productive an animal is in their lifetime, by current calculations used by the IPCC, we're going to see lower emissions per unit of weight and food. We're going to have a separate conversation on that one, but that's where we're currently at, and it's obviously driving a lot of decision making. And there's also production efficiency. So of course, healthy animals are much more efficient in their metabolism, and so they're able to use the energy more efficiently, and it reduces the waste and the emissions that come from the system. So that's definitely something that all farmers are working towards. More specifically, we've got genetic selective breeding. So we know that the rumen microbiome is constituting around 15 to 40% of inter-animal variation in enteric methane. So understanding the process and differences between different breeds is really important. And there's some work that obviously is showing quite clearly that that can lead to methane reduction by breeding lower emitting livestock. And selective breeding, there's actually some research looking at just reducing the size of cows, and that a 10% reduction in cow size could actually reduce emissions by up to 8% without affecting productivity. And so there's quite a lot of ongoing research there. There's also some slightly more Star Wars effects, like wearable devices. Some of you have probably seen them, where cows can actually wear devices that can deal with the methane, enteric methane, as it's leaving them through their burping. And vaccination is also something that's been looked at and is being considered as a potential route going forward to reduce methane. So that's vaccinating the livestock. Within PFL, we obviously, going back to this idea of balance, we very much are using sustainable pasture management. Our members and certainly the certified farmers at Pasture for Life are very familiar with this. So essentially, they're creating these resilient systems and looking to find that balance between the amount of greenhouse gases that are drawn in through carbon sequestration and the amount produced through the farm activity and the animal-based emissions. And there's quite a lot of research showing that that is possible. And we also, there's a number of, and I know I'm not going to spend too much on this because I know John will covering multi-species swards, but there are specific plants, coniferous legumes and willow, looking at things like bird's foot trefoil, sainfoin, that there's a growing body of evidence that when you include these into the diets, you can get methane reductions around 15%, well, 10 to 18% in different studies. And that when you then put in more diverse swards into diets, you can see even greater benefit. The problem is with research at the moment in this particular area, it's usually very, very controlled. And so we're not able to see it out on the pasture. We're not able to look in actual farms to see what's going on as easily. And so that's an area that's really needing a lot more research. And essentially, I don't know whether everyone can see, I keep things popping up on my screen, hopefully not. But certainly certainly not least is additives. These are going to alter the rumen's microbiome, and that's where we're concentrating today. There is a lot going on in the press in terms of methane mitigation supplements, in terms of when's it coming into play, what will these methane supplements be, and I think that's what we'd like to talk about today. That was a very brief introduction to methane, and I'm conscious of rushing through, but hopefully it gives everybody a bit of an initial insight, and really keen to hear a bit more in detail from John, and also then from Ed, who's actually practicing this on his farm. Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, Sarah. We lost your screen share a little bit at the end, but I think that was my fault for trying to rejig things so that John was ready to share his. So apologies for that, but I don't think we lost it. Yeah, I think you'd got your last slide already. So Sarah, thank you so much for running through a brief introduction to methane. Really, really useful to have that as a starting point. So I'm going to hand over to John. John, I'll let you introduce yourself because you'll do a much better job of it than I will, I'm sure. I'm really looking forward to hear what you're going to be sharing with us today and based in the research that you've been doing.
Well, thank you, Nikki, and thank you, Sarah, for an excellent introduction. Really good. Thank you. I'm also going to go fairly quickly because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time to hear from Ed, and then hopefully for some Q&A and discussion at the end as well. So, Nikki, can you see my screen on screen share properly?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so there's the title, Future of Methane Mitigation Through Feed Additives, but I really want to just correct that slightly for reasons that will become obvious and use the term feed supplements as a more general term rather than feed additive, which has a specific regulatory meaning. So what I'm going to talk about over the next 15 minutes or so is listed here, touch on the regulations in this area, and then the different topics that we'll come to. When it comes down to something more specific around feed additives, I'm only really going to focus a little on two examples, the product Bovaer 3-nitrooxypropanol from DSM, and then the product Mutral, which is a bit of a lead into Ed, I think. And at the end, and I want to make sure I do touch on this, as Sarah implied there, forages, multi-species pastures, and methane. Just as a quick reminder, try to be sort of as precise as we can when talking about methane. There are different ways of expressing methane, different metrics, which have different uses. So I'm going to talk about methane production, which is the total amount per cow per day, grams per day usually. Then there's methane yield, which is the amount of methane produced per unit of intake, whether that's dry matter intake or gross energy intake. And then there's methane intensity, which is the amount of methane produced per unit of food produced, essentially, whether that's milk or in a beef or growing lamb, of course, it's growth. Anyway, to the regulations. So the UK still uses the legislative framework inherited from the European Union, which is briefly listed here, and the distinction between feed materials and feed additives, which are covered by different regulations. Before we get into this, just the comment at the bottom of the slide here, from a regulatory perspective, suppliers have an overriding responsibility for feed safety, whether they are developing and then selling feed materials or developing and selling feed additives. Feed safety, by definition, comes first. Anyway, on to feed materials, and I've listed some text here that defines what a feed material is. It's something that's primarily there as a source of energy, so or the nutrients, proteins, for example. So these clearly are your forages, your concentrate ingredients like wheat, barley, sugar beet pulp, etc., etc. All the things you'll find in purchased feeds that are not chemically defined as feed additives will be feed materials. Basic nutrition for the animal. The comment there about labeling. So the labeling and the presentation, which includes advertising for feed materials, you are allowed to draw particular attention to the presence or absence of a substance in that feed, to a specific nutritional characteristic, or in my italics there, to a specific function. So if you have a feed material that, in addition to being a source of a nutrient, has an effect on methane, in this case, you would be allowed to draw attention to that fact. So some of the materials that you'll hear about, read about, get talked about in terms of methane mitigators are in fact feed materials. So if you're using a lipid source, a fat source like linseed oil, for example, there's talk of using nitrate, which technically is a feed material because it's a source of non-protein nitrogen and also of calcium. And garlic and seaweeds in general, are also feed materials. So you can only do this, that is, claim the specific function, if you've got some evidence. So it's only permissible to label or market or claim that you've got a specific function, methane mitigation, for a feed material, if you can provide substantiation of the claim, either by reference to published literature or through your own company research. On the other side, you've got feed additives, covered by a different regulation, and again, the definition's listed there. One particular category of feed additives, which is the one that's relevant here, is so-called zootechnical additives, which is any additive that you use to favorably affect animal performance, or, and the italics again are mine, that's used to affect favorably the environment. And this is a specific niche whereby the Bovaer product from DSM is now authorized as a zootechnical feed additive with a favorable effect on the environment, i.e. methane mitigation. So 3-NOP, Bovaer, that's where that fits. Some other feed additives that you'll see in some of these products are authorized, but not for that zootechnical function, but they're authorized as usually sensory compounds, flavorers, palatants, etc. And they also find their way into these products. The thing about the zootechnical feed additives is those authorizations are specific to the particular brand, and they must be renewed every 10 years, which gives the supplier a degree of protection and an ability to make some money in the market, I guess, but in a 10-year period. I'll move swiftly on, and hopefully that distinction will become clear in where it fits later on in the presentation. And I want to talk a little bit about concept of the pyramid of evidence. So what do we want to know about feed additives for methane mitigations? Well, firstly, does it work? I.e., in principle, under controlled experimental conditions, is there an effect in the animal? We'd like to know how big that effect is, clearly. And then this third question of, will it work for me? Which I think is a really big question. Are there interactions between the feed supplement and the environment in which it's used? In other words, does it work differently in high-yielding cows, low-yielding cows, high forage systems, low forage systems, etc., etc.? A whole range of factors about the farm environment in which these things might be proposed to be used. Do we understand all those potential interactions? Have we looked at all of that? And the broader, almost philosophical question, I think, underpinning this is, when do we know enough? When do we, as a society, as an industry, know enough to say yes or no? There is an effect worth going for here. So here's this picture of the pyramid of evidence, a common concept used in medical research, etc. And they start out at the bottom with somebody's opinion or some anecdote or a case study. And as you do more and more methodological research, gain more and more data, you rise up the pyramid. This is relevant when we think about feed additives and feed materials. So to get your authorization as a zootechnical feed additive, you would need to follow the guidelines that exist initially through the European Commission, and provide data from 3 in vivo experiments in the target species where you want the effect to be claimed. Not at the top of the pyramid of evidence, you're still then in a position when it's authorized that, yes, okay, you've got the authorization to place it on the market, but you're always going to want to do more experiments, more work, test out some of these interactions, etc., as time progresses. There is, however, potential for feed materials that you could claim that you had some benefit without having to have those 3 experiments in the target species. The guidelines for what you can say are not quite so clear in the legislation. Okay, coming on to the rumen itself, building on the very nice slide that Sarah showed us earlier, here's a simpler pictorial representation of what's going on in the rumen. So we have complex feedstuffs coming into the rumen, containing complex carbohydrates like fiber, cell walls, cellulose, hemicellulose, starch, etc., proteins, fats. So there's initially a sort of digestion step, a process of breaking those large molecules down into smaller molecules. And for the carbohydrates and the skeletons of amino acids, they are then fermented by the bacteria and the protozoa and the fungi in the rumen. And that fermentation process, which is in the rumen taking place without oxygen, is generating hydrogen and CO2. And you have to get rid of the hydrogen. It's not really for reasons of maintaining rumen pH, but if you don't get rid of the hydrogen, provide a sink for that hydrogen, then you will get a feedback effect and slow down fermentation and slow down digestion, which of course is not what we want to see. So the normal mechanism, the primary mechanism in the rumen that's evolved over time is methanogenesis, the synthesis of methane by organisms, separate group of organisms, often called methanogens, as Sarah explained. I think the Latin technical term is the archaea. So these then take the hydrogen, take the CO2, combine them together, several biochemical steps, and produce methane as the output. So you look at this simple representation and start to think, well, okay, where might we want to intervene to try to control methane, reduce methane emissions, whilst maintaining digestion and fermentation? So you could say, let's try to modify fermentation and produce less hydrogen in that process. And there are some ways that you can do that, usually by changing the balance of the volatile fatty acids in favor of propionate in the rumen. You could, in principle, say, well, okay, let's send the hydrogen somewhere else. Let's try to capture that hydrogen in an alternative sink other than methane. And thirdly, you could say, right, let's target those archaea or their biochemistry and directly inhibit methane. And some of the feed supplements that are in development really touch on different ones of these three kind of mechanisms. So products that are based essentially around plant extracts of one sort or another, often called essential oils. And the molecules in these products will be things like eugenol, thymol, usually quite volatile and usually natural chemicals produced by plants, often for purposes of their own defense against insects, against bacteria, against herbivores indeed. So they are the foundation of some products like, for example, Rumitec, to try to moderate that rate of fermentation, drive it more towards propionate. For alternative hydrogen sinks, the best example there is the use of nitrate, which is in some countries, not in the UK, being commercialized by Cargill as the product brand name Silvair. Touch on that in the next slide a little bit. And thirdly, in terms of inhibiting methane synthesis, this is really where 3-NOP, the molecule that's in the product Bovaer from DSM, where that fits in, and also then garlic from Mutral through a different mechanism, but is primarily targeting the direct inhibition of methane. It's also where the seaweed fits in. And again, caution on seaweed. I'd like to be much more specific than simply saying seaweed and methane. It is really only one genus of species of seaweed containing two species, two variants of Asparagopsis that have been identified as containing an active principle that directly inhibits methanogenesis. So all seaweed does not reduce methane. Asparagopsis, specifically a red tropical seaweed grown in the tropics, has a particular active molecule that does. So that's where they kind of fit a little bit mechanistically. Here's a quick summary. I'm not going to read through the whole of this table for reasons of time, but hopefully it's available in the slides, where I've tried to just look at some of those products that are either on the market or close to the market, what they are, what the active principle is in each of those products, a little bit about the effect size, and I've just shown one metric here. This is the methane yield per kilogram of dry matter intake in that third column. A comment on their regulatory status, and of course it's fine to be authorized and available for use, but there's got to be somebody there with the supply chain to make it available. And then finally a comment at the end. I'll just focus for reasons of time on the two that I mentioned earlier, the product called Bovaer or Bovaer 10 from DSM, which is the top line here. So the active principle is a molecule called 3-nitrooxypropanol, which is a synthetic molecule discovered through a large screening program that DSM undertook several years ago. And what's the effect size? I've quoted there a number, footnote number 1. We recently produced a report for DEFRA back in 2021, which was an assessment of the evidence that we could find at that time. And that's the number that came out of that exercise. That report for DEFRA is available online. Bit hard to find sometimes, these reports for DEFRA, but if anybody's interested, I could certainly point to it. It's about 25% reduction in methane yield. Its regulatory status now is that it is, at the start of this year, authorized in the EU and in the UK as a zootechnical feed additive. But note that it's only authorized for, in inverted commas there, what their expression, dairy cows and cows for reproduction. So you cannot yet utilize this product legally for growing beef or sheep, or goats for that matter. And that will come. I think DSM's simply got to compile their evidence of their dossier of evidence and pilot it through the various regulatory steps. In terms of a supply chain, DSM have invested in their factory in Dalry in Scotland, just close to Kilmarnock. And as far as I know, that development is due to come online in 2025. A comment about this particular product, it definitely works, as in there's strong evidence with multiple studies for that effect, but its effects are short-lived. Essentially, the molecule itself is consumed in the course of reducing methane. So once one molecule of this product has had its effect, it's gone. So it requires continual consumption. So this creates a problem, of course, if you're doing anything other than incorporating it into a total mixed ration. So how are we going to deal with, or how are DSM going to deal with, for example, grazing livestock? And they are working on some technological developments there, looking to develop slow release forms. I'll skip down just to talk a little bit briefly about Mutral, a product that the active principle really is garlic. It's a combination itself of garlic and some citrus oils, some plant extracts. The effect size, there's less evidence on this. There's a study that Ed was involved with a couple of years ago. Subsequently, the study that I'm quoting here, published in 2019, and one more recently that was, I think, a similar order of magnitude of effect as well. So I think there are probably 3 in vivo studies now in dairy that are reported. So it'd be a smaller effect proportionally than that would be the case for the Bovaer. Again, back to the regulatory situation, it's a complementary feed. It contains a feed material, which is the garlic, and there's this sensory feed additive, which is the citrus oil. And again, Ed may touch on the supply chain for that product. My comment on this, it's really interesting, I think, and hopefully Ed will explain a bit more about how it's used to generate a voluntary carbon credit, which provides the incentive for its use. Anyway, I won't spend any longer on this slide. The information is there. Happy to talk about it later if anybody's interested. Moving on to touch on this area of incentivization. Why should anybody use one of these products? So first area there is, well, if they were to improve animal performance, then maybe there's a milk yield or a growth benefit that itself would justify or pay for the product, and you'd simply get methane mitigation then as a co-benefit. I had a slide in, but I've just hidden it a little bit because of reasons of time to explore this a wee bit further. In general, if you're using a product that is going to reduce methane by about 20 to 30%, as some of those products can do, the evidence would suggest that you don't really get any beneficial effect in terms of animal performance. People say, well, in principle, you should, because methane is a loss of energy to the animal. And indeed, the original interest in researching ways to try to reduce methane was to try to reduce that energy loss and allow more energy to be available to the animal for production. But with those orders of magnitude of reduction, you don't generally get a benefit in terms of animal performance that would itself be sufficient incentive. Just one quick note on that. There's a very recent paper from concerning the Bovaer, the DSM product, from the Netherlands, where they'd fed the product for a full year to dairy cows at Wageningen. And there was some slight evidence of improvements in fat yield and protein yield, milk fat and milk protein yield. The second potential area for incentive then is, well, is your customer going to pay you, for example, by adding something into the milk price? And I suppose there's a relevant example here might be the ALA sustainability incentive, which includes a certain proportion of the milk price that would try to incentivize, for example, moving away from soybean meal in feeds, for covering slurry stores, for increased numbers of days at pasture. In other words, a whole range of different sustainability measures that could be paid for. There's currently no payment in there for the use of a feed additive, but the kind of the system, the structure is kind of set up that would make it quite easy for them to do so. And then there are, I mentioned this, the carbon trading schemes, and the example here would be this Cool Cows UK scheme, which is a project that would deploy the product Mutral in what is a written structured methodology within a program called the Verified Carbon Standard Program that was developed and is managed by an American non-profit organization called Vera. And this generates a thing called a verified carbon unit, which you can then go and sell. So anybody in the voluntary carbon markets that's looking for spending money to try to offset their own carbon emissions, you could choose to obviously go and pay somebody to plant trees, for example, but you could also go and put money in, buy these verified carbon units and encourage the adoption of Mutral. And again, very interested if Ed's going to comment on the success and his experience of that scheme. And then picking up Sarah's comments from earlier on, and I think I've written down here what she was reading on her opening slide about the potential for new government schemes to operate in this area, going back to this press release from DEFRA published in late October last year. A lot of words here on the page, but this it's worth bearing in mind. So again, the intent is clear, to deliver action to reduce methane emissions through these methane suppressing feed products in England. And the third paragraph there refers to the potential ways they might choose to do that. The schemes such as the Farming Innovation Programme, environmental land management schemes, or the introduction potentially of something totally new. I guess we wait and see what's likely to happen on that. So what's going to happen next in this whole area? Let's just firstly talking about the feed supplements themselves. Is there anything new coming along? I've listed on that earlier slide 4 or 5 different particular products that are either on the market or fairly close to the market. There are a few new developments that I'm aware of that are certainly at the research stage. There's interest in alternative ways to deliver the same effect that the seaweeds have in terms of a direct inhibition of methane, for example. Sarah mentioned things like vaccination. There are some older ideas in the feed supplement area that have got research, but perhaps there's no sort of novel intellectual property and not much incentive for a company to pick them up and try to develop them. It is, of course, interesting that the product that is out there on the market or is now authorized as a feed additive belongs to a very large multinational corporation with very deep pockets. So they've been able to invest the money. The second point on this slide, though, I think is what is beginning to happen and certainly needs to happen, which is more research, very applied research, to quantify these various interactions that might or might not exist. So first of those would be between the different supplements. So if you've got something that reduces methane by 10%, something else that reduces it by 20%, if you were to use the two of them together, do you get 30%? Or do you get less or do you get more? A lot of those interactions have not really been formally studied. What about interactions with basal diets or with feeding systems? We mentioned TMRs versus grazing systems, but it's known, for example, that the 3-NOP product actually works better in a high starch diet than a high fiber diet. Again, more of that work is needed. Interactions between the animal, both phenotype and genotype. You could say early lactation, late lactation. You could talk about the different breeds and different strains of cows, again, as Sarah mentioned earlier on. And one important thing, I think, is what I've called here the interaction with time. So do these feed supplements have their effects immediately as soon as you've started to use them? Do those effects persist over time? Again, a lot of the studies, certainly in the earlier studies, are almost by definition going to be relatively short term. I mentioned that it's only now, for example, that a study has appeared where the Bovaer product has been tested for a full year. So work around the globe really to look at all these different interactions is continued applied research that basically pushes us further up this pyramid of evidence as all those data accumulate. I wanted to finish by just highlighting that, yes, we've been talking here about feed supplements and methane. That's not where I like to start this kind of discussion. It's not the first tool in the toolbox to go for. I would much prefer really to talk about nutrition and methane much more generally, to look at the opportunities to manage methane. Again, what can you do by changing, for example, the composition of the diets in terms of sugar, starch, fiber, oil, fiber type, etc., particle size of fibers, and so on, all of which are known to have effects on methane. And then finally, it touches on the area of forages, which of course I know is a bit of interest perhaps to many people on this particular call. Just a couple of slides on this. I found just recently this paper, fairly new paper from Australia, published in 2023, really quite an interesting overview of this area about multi-species swards, alternative forage sources, and methane. So I put this, cut and pasted this particular picture, this particular figure from this paper. And it starts at the top with sort of laboratory work, often called in vitro work, where you take something and you have a look at it in the laboratory. Various methods exist. We have some capabilities in that area in SRUC to see just initially as a first quick look, is there the potential there for something, a particular plant or a particular component of a plant or an extract of a plant to have an effect on methane. The point I think the slide makes nicely, though, that's a long way from actually having something that you know about and can go out and encourage and use in practice. So again, an inverse period here to go from having assessed in vitro the reduction potential. Again, if we're talking about forage crops, well, of course, you've got the agronomic factors to bear in mind as well. Can you grow it? Can you grow it fast enough? Will it persist within a pasture, for example? All of those factors have to be taken into account. What are the effects on animal production and other attributes of the farming system as well, before you could then get to the stage at the bottom of this picture here where you've got something you can integrate into the farm system with confidence to know that you're going to get the benefits. And quotes from the paper I've shown here on the side of the slide. The anti-methanogenic properties of pasture species have been largely identified through in vitro fermentation and pen feeding studies. And then I would totally agree with this statement. It's a significant step from these studies to validating the efficacy at farm level. I think it indicates what needs to be done. Just a quick comment on this. There's an overlap, of course. We talked earlier on about plant extracts as being used as feed additives. So things that are distilled from or extracted with oil or alcohol from seeds and leaves, etc., a whole range of things, often used as sensory feed additives, but they often have effects on the rumen as well. And of course, some of these are exactly the same kinds of molecules as we're looking for in some of these different pasture species, whether we're talking about tannins in things like bird's foot trefoil, coumarins, which you can find in some forage legumes, and indeed plantain and chicory also have interesting saponin-type molecules in there as well. So there's a strong overlap between what we're delivering to the animal and delivering to the rumen through different forage plants and what has been, for other reasons, tried to be developed as feed additives. But if I look at the evidence currently about multi-species swards and methane, this is my last slide, but I'll take a moment to explain it. Methane, both from the left to the right, production, yield, and intensity, expressed against the proportion of the pasture that was not grass and was not clover, so the non-grass, non-clover species. And most of the lines on this chart, each line represents a different study from the literature, are pretty flat, pretty level. In other words, there's not much evidence here from the available evidence for lactating cows at grass, measured at grass, that an increase in those non-grass, non-clover species reduces methane. The message basically is that there's currently, for in vivo measures with animals at grass, limited evidence, I think, around multi-species swards and methane. More research is needed, and in a project that Pasture for Life are also involved with, along with ourselves, we hope this year to be generating some of those data ourselves at our campus near Dumfries. And I think I'm good there, finished there, and sorry I've taken a bit longer than I intended.
No worries. Thank you so much, John. We were very unfair asking for trying and get all of this into just an hour's webinar, but and I'm really grateful that you were able to be so succinct in what you were saying. Ed, do you want to get yourself sorted to share your screen if you need to, or are you just going to talk through your experiences? But hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes for questions at the end. Please do put your questions in the chat so that we can get them ready to ask as we go through. Ed, over to you.
Hi there. Yeah, I'll just chat away if that's okay. So a brief introduction to Braid's Farm. We are a farm in the northwest of England, predominantly housed. So we are producing milk for coffee shops, as you can see on the posters behind. The requirements of coffee shops are basically very consistent milk. We supply the milk all year round, so we're an all year round calving herd. And so in our geography and rainfall, we're really not suited towards grazing and pasture, and that will actually that inconsistency in the weather will then affect the grass and then affect the milk. So we have designed our farming system around the customers. We do have loafing paddocks for enrichment, but not necessarily for a large volume of nutrition. We came across mood trial when my elder brother Joe started a Nuffield scholarship to look into the Asparagopsis taxiforme. I think he thought he could travel the world and look at all these exotic seaweeds being grown in tropical places and look at how that could develop into a reduction for methane emissions. Whilst he was doing that preliminary research, came across Mootral, who, because they had a feed material, had a product that was ready for market, and they chose us because we had a discerning customer in terms of them coffee shops. Coffee shops were quite aware of the carbon footprint of milk, mainly because they'd been advertised at by milk alternatives about how bad it was in comparison to per litre for the milk alternatives. And so it became apparent that we had a market that might be interested in a methane reduced milk. They had a product that was ready for market, and we were happy to engage in them on the proviso that we weren't going to have garlic flavoured milk. That was a big consideration to us to make sure we didn't have a problem there. So we did a study on the farm, and SRUC were involved in the measurement of the methane here. They measured around a 30% reduction here on average. We found a bigger reduction in the Jerseys and the Holstein Friesians, and that then went on. We were incentivized to be involved in this industry because we had an interest and we had customers that cared. So we were looking at that pillar of getting more value for our milk, but it was very apparent that that wouldn't be appropriate for most farms. So that's when they went down the line of developing the Vera carbon audited carbon credits to incentivize other farmers to be able to reduce their emissions, despite not necessarily having a market like our market. That then, for us, we think that's a really good thing that can then help other products or other farms then reduce their emissions. It is a little bit like selling a service, so a service of effectively taking the pushback to work rather than the car and claiming the difference, rather than a lot of carbon credit projects that people are worried about, which might be associated to carbon locked up in forestry or carbon locked up in soil. I'll just check that message there. Yeah. So that's how we got involved. We've had various benefits from that just through our engagement in looking at this area and our engagement in trying to be involved in this area of reducing the methane emissions. And that has been through press, through publicity, and through our farm story. That's helped us get free publicity. We're a small farm, we don't have a big marketing budget to sell our milk. So through engaging in these solutions, we've increased our visibility and awareness to our customers. And other benefits that we found with Mootral that were maybe not expected, if we found a reduced number of flies. The productive side, like John mentioned there, is difficult to measure on a commercial scale, and certainly might be very, very minor on our farm with the product that we've used. But we've certainly not seen any significant downsides, and we've certainly not had garlic flavored milk, which has been brilliant. I know you're short on time, so happy to open it up for the questions, and I can tell more of a story if the questions are relevant.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ed. I think that's really interesting. And I guess one of the things that I'm going to start off with a question, is something that worries me a little bit about these approaches, is that we don't have enough accessible on-farm methane measuring equipment. So in an ideal world, over the next coming years, you would be able to bring some kit onto farm, do those assessments, and know that this was still having an effect, that it was doing what it says on the tin, and that you're able to kind of pass on that confidence to your customer. And the way that you've set that up sounds really interesting. Is that something that you're worried about, that you're kind of having to rely on the assumption that this is working, and that you're making that kind of sales pitch to the coffee shops, or are you kind of fairly confident that it's doing what it says it's doing?
It's certainly a challenge. It's not something that you can see, smell, hear, touch. It's not like it's something that's invisible and you're not aware of. And so you'd certainly need technology there to measure it. We would love that technology was developed and commercially available at a reasonable rate to be able to ensure that at all times. But our involvement is about a developing industry and knowing that products and measurement techniques aren't perfect, and that's okay at the beginning of an industry. And you can, our part is about being involved, telling a story so that customers care, and us getting that benefit too. So I think the fact that an industry is not perfect and an additive isn't perfect isn't a reason to not get involved, because how would anything develop?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And frustratingly, we put in a multi-million-pound bid along with some other organisations to develop a low-cost, open data-sourced methane measuring equipment on farm. And sadly, Innovate UK didn't feel that it had value, which was very frustrating. But John will know the frustrations of applying for money from various research grants. But John, you wanted to come in.
If I may, just to quickly comment on the same question about measuring methane. So there are some methods that you can use and take out onto commercial farms. We're just in the process, well, waiting for delivery of a couple of these green feed devices that are on in a little trailer, that are suitable for use out with animals at pasture. But they cost us a couple of £100,000, so you've got to get the funding to go and get them. But they offer some potential for being taken out onto commercial farms, and clearly something we'd be interested to do, particularly when you wanted to get down to the real practical situations, the real situations of animals out at pasture. Other methods that are in development, there's a lot of use of so-called sniffer techniques, which are most easily applied in the dairy sector in automatic milking stations, where you've got 50 cows or so that are always going to spend a couple of times a day, 3 times a day in the same place, where you can monitor and get at the air that they're exhaling whilst they're in the milking system. So there's quite some use of that, and some development of that for use in more conventional milking parlours. The other interesting area, and again, sorry, this is very much a dairy comment. I was listening to a seminar just this week by a European group about interpretations of the milk spectra. This idea has been around quite a long time, that you can analyze the milk, look at the spectral data, and from the spectral data predict methane. Does that work if you're dealing with methane that's made different by use of a feed supplement like Mutral or like Bovaer? Actually, not that clear. But the encouraging thing about this seminar was that it does seem to be now a little bit more of a coordinated international effort to try to develop these prediction equations and make them available through milk recording organizations in different countries. So a little bit more optimistic maybe that that's going to be useful for some circumstances, if not necessarily for all of these feed supplements. But again, of course, it's milk, so it's only relevant to dairy.
Thanks, John. There was a question in the chat that came through during your part of the presentation from Talis, who says, presumably the need to inhibit methanogenesis with the various options will depend on what the ruminant is actually consuming. So yeah, I mean, you have touched a little bit on that, but could you just go into a bit more detail? I suppose being quite broad about different feed systems would be handy.
So yeah, this gets quite interesting in the implications for some of this. But in the fermentation process, so back to the production of hydrogen, and I think it was in more detail actually on Sarah's slide than on mine. So in that fermentation process, you're producing these volatile fatty acids, short-chain fatty acids, acetic acid, propionic acid, butyric acid are the main 3 components of that. The production of propionic acid actually consumes hydrogen in that metabolic process, whereas the production of acetic and butyric acids produces hydrogen. So if you can shift that fermentation balance in favor of propionate, which is usually about 20% of the total, and reduce the amount of acetate and proportions of acetate and butyrate, you'll have less hydrogen produced in total. And the nutritional factors that drive that pattern, that profile of VFAs, is primarily the carbohydrate sources, with starches driving propionate and fiber sources driving acetate, which leads on to the very general point that a high starch diet will tend to produce less hydrogen and therefore less methane, whereas a high fiber diet will tend to produce more hydrogen and therefore more methane. So does that mean we should be going around putting less forage, less fiber, and more concentrates into our farm animals? Well, of course, that's only part of the story, because it then ignores completely the resources that you use to generate those feedstuffs. So we've got to really approach this from a different point of view in terms of the role of forage-based, high fiber type diets, whether it's dairy or beef. And look at the other attributes of that system in terms of not competing with land, not competing for land with food production, and making sure that we've got the best low-cost, non-human edible biomass going into our animal production systems. So debates that just focus on methane quite rapidly become quite sort of sterile and limited, because you're not looking at the bigger picture. Sorry, I'm extrapolating a little bit there from the question, I think, Nikki.
No, that's a really interesting and useful response. And actually, we've literally just had some information through on another project that we're involved in, a Horizon project, that is looking at more holistic LCAs, so life cycle assessments. Yep. And that's what's really fascinating. We're moving away from that single lens and looking more holistically. You've got to look at the overall circularity of the food system, and then how you best operate your livestock systems in regions such as where I am looking out of my window at home now at beautiful green grass of Dumfries and Galloway. This is the place that we should be growing that grass and using it to produce fine quality milk and beef. Excellent, thank you. Sarah, you want to come in, but just before you do, just to say, you know, folks, please do, if you've got a question, pop it in the chat and we'll try and pick it up in the next 5 minutes. But Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, it was actually just sort of a general question around, I don't know whether anybody on the call would have a view. Ed, I know anecdotally you maybe would be able to say, but this idea of sort of changing the microbiota of the rumen and picking up on, which I hadn't been aware of, that this actual journey of these particular bacteria making up only a very small proportion of the microbiome available. What's the likelihood, or do we have any research available? Maybe a question for John in terms of long-term impact on the metabolic health of the rumen, or short-term changes, positive or negative. I don't know whether, I think, Ed, I seem to remember you maybe would say you don't think the cows, I think your answer when I asked you when I was on, you know, visiting, that you don't, the cows are just carrying on as they were, no difference, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, but is with all of these things, and actually it wouldn't matter whether it was whatever the solution, are we just leaping into the dark in terms of understanding 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, thinking probably about human microbiomes and the obsession with it, you know, and how that relates?
I think the dogma, scientific dogma, about the rumen fermentation process has always been, going back to sort of theoretical work in the 60s and 70s when sort of pioneers of rumen microbiology were working, that if you don't allow an outlet for that hydrogen that is produced through the anaerobic process of fermentation, and again, ourselves, for example, we are doing the same thing. We're oxidizing those sugars in our own metabolism, but we are aerobic organisms. We've got oxygen around in our systems to basically pick up those electrons and avoid the production of the hydrogen. You can't do that in an anaerobic environment with anaerobic organisms functioning without oxygen in the rumen. So this is where the process of methanogenesis has evolved. And the dogma has always been that if you stopped methanogenesis, you get this buildup of the hydrogen within the rumen. It's not about pH, it's not about acidosis or anything like that. It's a negative feedback effect on the fiber digesting bacteria that would then function less effectively and grow more slowly, and therefore ultimately digest less forage. So the idea was then that you would inevitably almost have a reduction in digestibility if you then stopped methanogenesis, or opposite to that, if you promoted methanogenesis, could you improve forage and fiber digestibility? But at the levels of inhibition that we're talking about here, with some of these products we've talked about, orders of magnitude of say 20 to 30%, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that anything is going wrong in terms of the fermentation process or reductions in digestibility. You certainly get an increase in hydrogen, so the immediate response to stopping hydrogen going to methane, or reducing the amount of hydrogen that's going to methane, is to put more out as hydrogen into the atmosphere. But it doesn't seem to have a particularly negative effect on the animal at that sort of order of magnitude. And that's true, I think, in that long-term study I mentioned, long-term being just 1 year, that's just come out from Wageningen. What would happen if you were to combine these things and aim for, say, a 50% or a 60% reduction in methane, which we're not currently operating in that space? I don't think we know yet. You'd obviously have to do the work and find out what the consequences were.
Thanks, John. We have 1 minute, and there's a question that says, so cereal-fed cows produce less methane than grass-fed, ? What about methanotrophs in grasses?
Really interesting question. I'm not going to tackle that in 30 seconds, but I'd like to pick that up with whoever the question has come from, if that's possible to continue that conversation after the event today. Nikki, that'd be really great.
Absolutely, John. I can put you in touch with Talis via email if that's handy.
Yep, please do.
Sure. And I think that's maybe that's the title of our next webinar. So that would be another thing for us to discuss. Thank you all so much. Sarah, thank you so much for your kind of brief explainer at the start. John, thank you so much for fitting so much interesting science into a very short period of time. And Ed, it's been really great to hear about your experiences of how this works on farm, and also a little bit more about the farm in detail. So we will finish up there, just because I'm keen to finish on time. But again, a huge thank you to everybody for coming along as well, and for some interesting questions. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. We will share the recording as well, of course. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Bye.
Take care.